Good evening and welcome to the Modise Network. After repeated denials and heated parliamentary debates, the state capture project is finally coming under the spotlight. The commission headed by Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo will start its inquiry tomorrow. We trace the history of this sordid drama, apparently spearheaded by the Gupta family. We look at the story from the point of view of journalists, civil society and academia who uncovered this rot. Reports emerged in drips and drabs, and whispers doing the rounds were that the Gupta family were running the state-owned entities and parts of government with President Jacob Zuma's permission. Obvious signs were there, with the SABC holding and covering breakfasts paid for by the SOEs for the benefit of the channel ANN7, then owned by the Guptas. It was an odd arrangement for the cash-strapped SABC. Some SACP members confronted President Zuma at the NEC meetings of the ANC, accusing him of being captured. A news report said two senior government officials had commented on record about the direct involvement of the Gupta family with offers of bribery to commit acts of corruption. The president denied knowledge and did not act on these allegations. The investigative journalists continued to piece the stories together until the breakout of the Gupta leaks by Amabhungane and the Daily Maverick. Now, the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture starts its work tomorrow under Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. Tonight, we retrace our steps by looking at the role of the media in uncovering the corruption that brought President Zuma down, and later we quantify the damage done to state institutions and the economy. My first guest is Amabhungane's investigative journalist, Micah Reddy. Micah, pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for the invite.
Well, it's a big, long story, right? It's been an ongoing opera of sorts. News reports in the media, Parliament holding its own hearings, EFF being chucked out of Parliament, a whole amount of drama over the years. Let's go back in time. Where did it all start for you? What was the first story, the earliest story you remember about this?
The earliest story I remember about the Gupta leaks was long before I was a journalist. I remember a story about them landing a helicopter at Zoo Lake, I think it was. And that caused a big controversy because it seemed like a bit of a storm in a teacup then, but it was it was an unlawful thing and unusual to land a helicopter at Zoo Lake without permission. A private family doing that is very odd. But later on, it started to sort of fit. And looking back at it now, it seems like it was a very sort of telling precursor to the whole Waterkloof incident. But you're right. Long before the Gupta leaks, we'd been focusing on the Guptas. We'd chipped away at the Gupta story for years before, and slowly started to build this picture up.
And of course,
it was the Gupta leaks that really allowed us to sort of connect the dots.
Sure, and some journalists went out to even write books about it and retrace their steps. But I think the event that put the spotlight on the Guptas specifically was that, in your case, the landing of the helicopter. For everybody else, the landing of the plane at the Waterkloof Air Base.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was such a symbolic thing because it symbolized the sense of entitlement, the arrogance of this family that had wormed its way into the heart of power. Getting these blue light brigades to escort them from this airport that they had totally illegally landed at with a plane full of wedding guests. And what we uncovered around that whole Waterkloof Sun City wedding was fascinating. It gave us an insight into the thinking of this family. There was, I don't know.
But a lot of people were still skeptical, though, about this story, that it's a minor incident, but in the scheme would not be a minor event. The landing of the plane at a national key point, such as the Waterkloof.
Well, I don't think it was that minor an incident. I mean, we're talking about a national key point.
I agree, but to people who who pay attention to these things. But I think a substantial number of people said, but you're blowing, it cannot be that the government has been taken over in that sense, even though it felt like it.
Yeah.
And I suppose the response to that by President Zuma was even more telling, isn't it? That the fact that to him did not seem to be such
exactly.
a big issue.
It showed the ease with which this family could facilitate things that were very irregular, very illegal, and in its own interest. And I think that's what the importance of the whole Waterkloof incident was. This was a national key point. It's supposed to be a highly secure area. It's a military base, and you have this private family who happen to be pals with the president, being able to completely flout the rules and bully officials into allowing this sort of thing to happen.
But you know,
so it was telling much more broadly of this criminal syndicate that the Guptas
the question about that relationship was raised repeatedly in Parliament, and the president fobbed it off and said, you know, anybody can be friends with me. What's wrong with having a friend as that family? But when you, as we went on in time, did you personally, and through whatever work you were doing in the NGO sector, I know you were there, have a strong sense that there is something untoward going on?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the president's constant refrain was just to deny it and eventually just laugh it off, as we all saw on TV. But it was obvious to anyone who was following the story that, you know, Waterkloof aside, there was a lot going on behind the scenes. And that key state institutions were effectively being taken over by this criminal network, by the family and their political allies. And that became obvious very early on. Parliament, for a very long time, turned a blind eye. But ultimately, in the last around the time of the Gupta leaks, but even before then, so much started to come out. You know, they couldn't plug the leaks. It became so glaringly obvious that this family had effectively captured large parts of the state and certainly captured the most powerful political figure in the country.
Well, Solima Paila also used the word, apparently, or the expression that the president is captured in November, I think, or December of 2015 at one such meeting, and the story emerged over the weekend, and he confirmed. And then it became a popular word that we use now when we talk about the corruption that was going on within the state, engineered by the Guptas. But what exactly is state capture? Because I recall the early days of talk about state capture, people were debating what this is, saying, you know, there's always that relationship between business and political elites. Would that be regarded as state capture? But in the context of South Africa, what do we mean? Because the president, for instance, has put this commission together. But from your point of view, how do you define it?
Well, it is a tricky thing, and often the lines are quite blurry, especially in a fragile young democracy, but even in for instance, what are widely considered to be the established democracies of the world. I mean, look at the nexus of business interests and US politics, for instance. A lot of that looks very, very dubious. And in South Africa, with the Guptas, that sort of thing was just very glaringly obvious, that you had this intersection between high-level politics and business interests, personal business interests, that was totally against the public interest, that worked against the public interest, that undermined key institutions, that was hugely damaging to democracy.
And deviated from even the objectives of some of the plans and the projects that the state itself had put together.
Yeah, so key institutions of the state were taken over and sort of reconfigured, redirected towards the interests of this very narrow clique of individuals.
Now, when you looked at how the SABC, for instance, under Hlaudi Motsoeneng, conducted itself with the broadcast of the breakfast, using SABC resources, and those being sponsored by state-owned enterprises, but the money not going to the SABC that needed the money anyway, which still does up to now, but the money going to another channel.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the signs were there very early on, long before the Gupta leaks. And the effects are absolutely still being felt. The effects will continue to be felt for a very, very long time. There are huge opportunity costs here, right? A lot of that money will never be recovered. Most of it, I would imagine, will not be recovered. We haven't seen people haven't seen the people at the heart of this really brought to book yet, and it has crippled the most vital institutions in the country. Something like the SABC, that was this model of transformation. Institutions like SARS, for instance. SARS was the crown jewel in our bureaucracy, and it was undermined, captured so quickly, and quite effectively, I must say.
But now, looking back to the role of the media, again, from your point of view, how do you think the story was covered up to this point? I mean, it continues to be a major story, but your take on it, because at some point, those disagreeing with the notion of state capture were saying, it's a white monopoly media story, this, and the media is reactionary in any event and is anti-radical economic transformation.
I mean, in a sense, I think the Guptas were very good for investigative journalists, good for our job security. They kept us busy for a long time. And I think it's really underscored the importance of rigorous investigative journalism. And it was, I mean, the amazing thing about the way this was covered is that it wasn't just the so-called mainstream media taking this on. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the Freda Dairy case, that was first, we first got wind of that through a local community newspaper. So it was this coming together. You look at the Gupta leaks, a whole lot of different organizations coming together to take this on, spending a great amount of time muckraking, rigorously going through everything with a fine comb, connecting the dots. The role of civil society, of course, was very important in all of this. But I think it has helped renew the public's faith in investigative journalism to a very large degree.
Micah Reddy is my guest, and we will be discussing the Gupta leaks. It was a large amount of emails that were found, put together, and had to be connected. The talk became connect the dots, and you see where that takes you. And several stories emerged out of that. We will continue our discussion with Micah Reddy in a moment.